Okay, so continuing with example 5a. The next thing we're asked to create is a schedule of cash disbursements for operating expenses by month and for the quarter. Now, in one sense, this is going to be fairly straightforward. We're not told anything about these expenses being paid in different months than they're incurred, so we can kind of assume that these are going to be paid at the same time that they're incurred. So we don't have a timing issue in these expenses. In this example we have here, we don't have a timing issue in the expenses like we do with our merchandise purchases. However, we do have a cash disbursement issue because we have a non-cash expense that we have to worry about. So we have sort of two different ways we can deal with our non-cash expenses. I'll show you both of these ways in this video. So we will do a schedule of cash disbursements for operating expenses. Most of what we have here, we've got variable and fixed expenses. These we can just sort of copy and paste to save us some typing. We know that sales commissions are 5% of revenue, and the rest of these are fixed. So to make life simple, I'll simply take our 5%, multiply that by revenue, drag that across, and our fixed expenses, we can simply drag these down and across, and because they're fixed, we expect them to be the same each month, or at least unaffected by the amount of revenue. Now, of course, in real life, fixed expenses aren't always fixed and exactly the same every month, but fixed expenses are unaffected by revenue. In this example, we're assuming things that might be a little bit unrealistic. We wouldn't necessarily have exactly the same advertising expense or exactly the same utilities expense every month. We would have reasons why those might change. We have specific ad campaigns and in specific marketing outlets and marketing resources that we use. Our utilities expense is going to vary based on temperature and things like that. But the point here that we're trying to make is that we've got a variable expense that is keyed to our amount of sales activity, and we've got fixed expenses that are not. So what we can do with these expenses is we can, first of all, we can simply list the ones that we're going to pay in cash, and then we can get our cash disbursements for operating expenses and simply sum these up. And there we go. However, there's a bit of a problem we might run into because these are not all of our operating expenses. In this case, there is one example of a non-cash operating expense, and that's depreciation. And there are a couple different ways to handle this. We can simply leave depreciation out of our schedule of cash disbursements for operating expenses because depreciation is a non-cash expense. But what that does is it gives us a schedule here of operating expenses that's a little bit incomplete. So we can add non-cash expenses. In this case, I'll just leave it expense because it's only one. And we have our depreciation every month. And then we can have a total operating expenses, in which case we are budgeting both cash and non-cash operating expenses for the month and for the quarter. So it's one way we can handle the difference between our cash and our non-cash expenses. So this would be our schedule of cash disbursements for operating expenses, option A. We have another way we can do this. I'll call it option B. And what we would do in option B is similar, except what we would do is we would include all of our expenses together in one line item and have our total operating expenses line come first. Oops, this didn't key to the right revenue number. Fix those. So we have our total operating expenses, and then we can subtract out our non-cash expense, depreciation, and then what we're left over when we subtract out our non-cash is our cash disbursements for operating expenses. So there are two ways to handle it that get us to the same place, where in both places we have a line item for total operating expenses visible, and we have a line item for cash disbursements for operating expenses. Same thing here, we have our line item for cash disbursements for operating expenses, and we've got our total operating expenses. Either way, we get both pieces of data. What we don't want to do is we don't want to kind of combine them in a way that doesn't make sense and list our non-cash expenses and then, list our cash expenses without depreciation and then subtract depreciation out of it. I see that sometimes. So you want to be careful to make sure that what you're doing makes sense. Either one of these options is totally fine and acceptable. You just kind of have to be clear as to what you are including and excluding. But either way, you've got the total cash you need to pay and the total operating expenses that will hit your income statement.